In the previous chapter, we saw the conclusion for the Battle of Thebes, and the city's great demise. There was still the question of Athens left. Will it share the fate of Thebes? Arrian begins chapter 10 so.
As soon as news of the calamity which had befallen the Thebans reached the other Greeks, the Arcadians, who had set out from their own land for the purpose of giving aid to the Thebans, passed sentence of death on those who had instigated them to render aid. The Hellenes also received back their exiles from banishment, because they were Alexander's adherents, and the Aetolians, each tribe for itself, sent embassies to him, begging to receive pardon, because they also had attempted to effect a revolution, on the receipt of the report which had been spread by the Thebans. The Athenians also, who, at the time when some of the Thebans, escaping from the carnage, arrived at Athens, were engaged in celebrating the great mysteries, abandoned the sacred rites in great consternation, and carried their goods and chattels from the rural districts into the city. The people came together in public assembly, and on the motion of Demosthenes, elected from all the citizens 10 ambassadors, men whom they knew to be Alexander's special adherents, and sent them to signify to him, though somewhat unseasonably, that the Athenian people rejoiced at his safe return from the land of the Illyrians and Triballians, and at the punishment which he had inflicted upon the Thebans for their rebellion.
Thebes were not without allies, but in the end, they remained alone. The Arcadians were on their way to relieve Thebans at siege, and probably came as far as Corinth. There, however, they waited to see if their involvement would actually matter. Hearing that the scales swung into Alexander's favor, they executed those proponents of aiding the revolt. People of Elis recalled back men they just banished, those in support of Alexander. Aetolians sent ambassadors and begged Alexander's forgiveness for their role in the revolt. But what about Athens, the grand city of Attica? At the time they were celebrating the great or Eleusinian mysteries, an important religious rite for the cult of Demeter and Persephone, with the main theme being the ascent of Persephone back to the surface, reuniting with her mother and beginning of spring. The rites were considered one of the most important and solemn rituals in ancient Greece. That year, they were abruptly cancelled. Hearing the news of what happened to Thebes, Athenians began to move provisions and people from the rural surroundings into the city, a standard procedure when the city was faced with an attack. Demosthenes was a leader of the faction in support of Alexander, but also an avaricious but skilled orator. He was bribed by Demosthenes to argue in his favor and, supported by the assembly, the main political body of ancient Athens, they sent to Alexander an embassy of 10 envoys who were well disposed towards him, including Demosthenes, with the goal to placate the Macedonian king. In these actions, we can finally see the effect that the destruction of Thebes had. The anti-Alexander movement led by Demosthenes that was prevalent just a few days ago, lost momentum. The great celebrations were immediately cancelled and preparations for a siege began. Fear spread in the city and all efforts were put towards improving relations with Alexander and avoiding the fate of Thebes. And Alexander's reaction to all of this? Arrian describes the following events.
In regard to other matters he gave the embassy a courteous reply, but wrote a letter to the people demanding the surrender of Demosthenes and Lycurgus, as well as that of Hyperides, Polyeuctus, Cores, Charidemus, Ephialtes, Diotimus, and Moracles, alleging that these men were the cause of the disaster which befell the city at Chaeronea, and the authors of the subsequent offensive proceedings after Philip's death, both against himself and his father. He also declared that they had instigated the Thebans to revolt no less than had those of the Thebans themselves who favored a revolution.
The wheels of war have stopped turning, and diplomacy began anew. Alexander names the instigators of the revolt, the same ones who were supposedly to blame for the old Battle of Chaeronea, which finalized the dominance of Macedonia in the Greek space, with Philip and Alexander defeating the Greek coalition force. These have been either military men or orators, with Demosthenes chief among them, who led the anti-Macedon movement. Arrian specifically states that Alexander considered these Athenians as guilty of Theban revolt, as those Theban exiles that returned into the city and sparked the rebellion. But negotiations continued, as does Arrian.
The Athenians, however, did not surrender the men, but sent another embassy to Alexander, entreating him to remit his wrath against the persons whom he had demanded. The king did remit his wrath against them, either out of respect for the city of Athens, or from an earnest desire to start on the expedition into Asia, not wishing to leave behind him among the Greeks any cause for distrust. However, he ordered Charidemus alone of the men whom he had demanded as prisoners and who had not been given up, to go into banishment. Charidemus therefore went as an exile to King Darius in Asia.
When Demosthenes heard of Alexander's demand to give up the 9 men, He compared it to an anecdote of the wolves asking the sheep to surrender the dogs that protected them. They sent another embassy to Alexander, hoping to soften the king's anger. The man responsible was Phocion, one of the most important Athenian politicians and a skilled military commander. He was known for his virtues, honesty and integrity, and had as such earned respect and contempt within the Athenian assembly and the Greek world. He had also earned respect from Philip, Alexander's father. According to Plutarch, when Alexander accepted Phocion, he listened attentively to his proposal and advice. So well suited was Phocion's petition with Alexander's nature and desires, that he drastically changed and softened his feelings and demands towards Athens. Of the group that Alexander targeted, only Charidemus was banished from Athens, seeking shelter at the court of Persian King Darius. Charidemus was an experienced mercenary commander, but born in Euboea and not native to Athens, being granted its citizenship afterwards. As such, he was a sacrifice Athenians were more ready to accept than those men of established and distinguished Athenian families. In Persia, Charidemus became Darius' military advisor, but his end wasn't happy. Just 2 years later, he would be executed shortly before the Battle of Issus for being too forthright when pointing out the weaknesses of the Persian army, advising Darius not to rely on his Asiatic troops in the contest with Alexander, but to subsidize an army of Grecian mercenaries. Surely, this decision would not come back to haunt Darius. Alexander made Phocion a friend and honored him more than many of his close associates. Between his advice to focus on Persia and leave Greece be, and due to Alexander's respect for Athens, the Macedonian king turned back home, satisfied with the knowledge that he was the dominant force in the region. Within 1 year, Alexander subdued Thracians, Triballoi, Getae, Illyrians, and Greeks. However, he failed from a perspective of an older goal, the one set already by his father, to be seen by the Greek states as one of them, as Greek, and be given respect in such a manner. But the respect they gave them was still out of fear than any other reason. To them, Alexander was a barbarian invading and bullying their civilized land. A wolf wearing sheep's clothing. This, however, could not disguise a simple fact that Alexander succeeded in subduing Greece, which would now support his campaign into Asia. Once more, it is worth crediting his father Philip, who made the Macedonian army the greatest war machine far around. Alexander inherited this weapon and was also skilled enough to use it well. He established his dominance in Europe, and now, he turns east. How far will he come? We will find out soon enough.